Some people mistake confidence for trespassing, until the truth reminds them who really belongs. The morning sun spilled across the quiet street in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina, painting long shadows over the polished stone entrance of a luxury apartment building where everything seemed perfectly in place. Residents hurried toward work with coffee cups in hand, delivery trucks rolled by at an easy pace, and the city carried the comfortable rhythm of another ordinary Tuesday. Sitting on the wide granite steps at the front entrance was a black man wearing a faded gray hoodie, dark jeans, and worn sneakers. A paper coffee cup rested beside him while he quietly watched the neighborhood wake up. His expression was calm, almost thoughtful, as though he had nowhere else he needed to be. Every few minutes someone walking past offered a polite smile. One elderly woman even waved before disappearing around the corner. To anyone willing to look closely, nothing about the man suggested trouble. Yet not everyone was willing to look closely. A patrol cruiser turned onto the block and slowed almost immediately. Officer Ethan Brooks scanned the sidewalk through his windshield before stopping directly in front of the building. His eyes locked onto the man sitting on the steps, and within seconds he had already decided what kind of story he believed he was seeing. He stepped out of the cruiser, adjusted his duty belt, and walked toward the entrance with the confidence of someone certain he already knew the ending. Several pedestrians slowed their pace without realizing it. A dog walker paused across the street. A ride-share driver glanced into his rearview mirror. Something about the officer's determined stride drew quiet attention before a single word had even been spoken. Marcus Bennett looked up as the shadow stretched across the steps. His eyes met the officer's without fear or frustration. He simply waited. Officer Brooks folded his arms. "You can't stay here," he said firmly. "This is private property. You're going to need to move." Marcus remained seated. He took one slow sip of coffee before placing the cup beside him again. "Good morning, officer," he answered politely. "Is there a problem?" The question sounded genuine, almost kind, but it only seemed to deepen the officer's confidence. "The problem," Brooks replied, "is that residents have the right to feel safe around their own building." Marcus glanced briefly toward the elegant glass doors behind him before looking back at the officer. "I agree," he said. "They absolutely do." Brooks frowned. That wasn't the answer he expected. "Then stand up and leave." Around them, more people quietly stopped. A maintenance worker carrying a toolbox slowed his pace. A young couple waiting for a rideshare exchanged uncertain glances. Phones remained in pockets, but curious eyes lingered. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he rested his hands together and looked at the officer with surprising patience, almost as if he had seen this moment coming long before the patrol car rounded the corner. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "Officer," he said evenly, "before you ask me to leave, are you absolutely certain you know whose front steps these are?" The question hung in the crisp morning air. For just a heartbeat, even the sounds of traffic seemed farther away. But Officer Brooks didn't hesitate. He mistook calmness for defiance, certainty for arrogance, and dignity for disrespect. Without realizing it, he had already taken the first step toward a mistake that would soon leave an entire city questioning how easily appearances can outweigh simple facts. 45 minutes earlier, the same street had looked almost empty beneath a pale morning sky as Marcus Bennett guided an aging blue pickup truck into a visitor parking space beside the building. The truck was clean but far from impressive, carrying the kind of quiet where that came from years of dependable use instead of luxury. Anyone watching would have assumed its driver worked nearby or had come to meet someone inside. Marcus stepped out wearing the same gray hoodie and comfortable jeans, carrying nothing more than a small paper bag and a reusable coffee mug. There was no expensive watch on his wrist, no polished shoes, no designer sunglasses announcing success before he spoke a single word. That was exactly how he preferred it. He believed respect should never depend on appearances, even though experience had taught him that many people still made decisions within seconds of seeing someone they did not know. As he crossed the sidewalk, the morning air carried the scent of fresh coffee drifting from a neighborhood cafe a block away. A gentle breeze rustled the young maple trees lining the street while maintenance crews prepared nearby flower beds for the summer season. The neighborhood was waking slowly, peacefully, exactly the way Marcus liked it whenever he visited. Before reaching the entrance, he noticed Mrs. Evelyn Carter struggling with 2 grocery bags near the curb. Without hesitation, he walked over with an easy smile. "Good morning, Miss Evelyn," he said warmly. "Let me give you a hand." The elderly resident smiled with immediate recognition. "You always seem to show up at the right time," she replied as Marcus carried the bags all the way to the lobby. They spoke for a minute about her grandchildren and the unusually cool weather before she thanked him again. Marcus simply wished her a wonderful day and continued outside. A few minutes later he stopped beside the landscaping crew where a young groundskeeper was adjusting a sprinkler head. "Looks great," Marcus said. "The new flowers should really brighten the courtyard." The worker grinned. "We hope so, sir." Marcus nodded with quiet approval before continuing toward the front steps. He enjoyed these visits because they reminded him that buildings were never just concrete and glass. They were communities filled with people whose lives quietly intersected every single day. He settled onto the broad granite steps with his coffee and watched residents leave for work. Parents walked children toward the nearby elementary school. A bicycle courier laughed with a doorman delivering newspapers. A golden retriever eagerly greeted nearly everyone passing by. Marcus smiled more than he spoke, content to observe the neighborhood he had spent years helping transform into one of the safest and most welcoming blocks in the city. Across the street, a small real estate office opened its doors for the day, and one of the agents gave Marcus a friendly wave that he returned with a slight nod. None of those ordinary moments seemed remarkable on their own, yet together they painted a picture few strangers would ever notice. To most passing drivers, he was simply another black man sitting alone on expensive property. They could not see the years of careful planning, long nights studying contracts, difficult financial decisions, or countless meetings that had made this place what it had become. They certainly could not imagine that every brick surrounding them represented part of a dream he had built through patience rather than privilege. So when the patrol cruiser finally appeared at the end of the block, Marcus noticed it without changing his expression. He lifted his coffee for another quiet sip, watching the vehicle approach with the calm confidence of someone who already understood that assumptions often arrive much faster than the truth. Marcus Bennett had learned long ago that the quickest way to discover what people believed was to give them nothing except an ordinary first impression. Expensive suits invited admiration. Luxury cars earned assumptions of success. But simple clothes often revealed something far more valuable. They revealed character, not his own, but everyone else's. That was why he never rushed to explain himself when strangers questioned where he belonged. As Officer Ethan Brooks stood before him with growing confidence, Marcus remained exactly where he was, his posture relaxed, his voice steady, his eyes reflecting neither anger nor fear. Around them the sidewalk continued to fill with quiet observers who sensed that something unusual was unfolding. A young mother slowed as she pushed a stroller past the entrance. 2 construction workers across the street paused beside their truck before pretending to organize their tools while watching from a distance. The city never truly stopped moving, yet moments like these had a way of pulling everyone's attention without anyone saying a word. Officer Brooks took another step closer. "I have asked you politely," he said. "Now I am asking you again. Stand up and move along." Marcus tilted his head slightly. Almost curious. "May I ask what makes you believe I should leave?" The officer seemed surprised by the question. "Because this property is for residents and authorized visitors." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as though considering the answer. "That sounds reasonable," he replied. "It is important to protect private property." Brooks interpreted the response as surrender. "Then we understand each other." Marcus smiled faintly. "Perhaps we do. Perhaps we do not." The brief exchange left an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. The officer expected excuses, complaints, or arguments. Instead he found calm confidence that refused to match the situation he believed he had walked into. That quiet composure unsettled him more than open resistance ever could. Across the lobby, the front desk receptionist noticed the conversation through the glass doors. She reached for the telephone before stopping herself, uncertain whether she should interrupt. A maintenance supervisor walking through the hallway slowed his pace after recognizing Marcus outside. He frowned with quiet confusion but continued toward another section of the building, believing the conversation would surely end within moments. Marcus rested his coffee beside him again. "Officer," he said gently, "how long have you worked this neighborhood?" "Long enough to know when something does not look right," Brooks answered without hesitation. Marcus gave a slow nod. "Experience is valuable. So is taking one extra minute before reaching a conclusion." Brooks folded his arms tighter. "You seem very comfortable giving advice." "Only because I have learned how expensive assumptions can become." The words landed softly, without accusation, but they lingered in the cool morning air. A businessman standing nearby glanced from Marcus to the officer, sensing that the conversation carried more weight than either man openly revealed. Marcus looked briefly toward the building entrance, where sunlight reflected across the polished glass. He recognized every detail of the property, every improvement completed over the past decade, every family who now called it home. To him it was never just another address. It represented years of determination, difficult choices, and promises kept. Yet none of those memories appeared on the surface. All Officer Brooks saw was a black man in an old hoodie sitting comfortably where he believed he did not belong. Marcus understood that reality all too well. He had encountered it in boardrooms, restaurants, airports, and neighborhoods across the country. The faces changed. The assumptions rarely did. Even so, he refused to allow bitterness to shape his response. Respect, he believed, lost its meaning the moment it depended on someone else's behavior. So instead of defending himself, he simply waited, knowing that truth had a remarkable habit of arriving exactly when patience refused to leave. Officer Ethan Brooks reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, his expression hardening as though every calm answer Marcus offered only confirmed the conclusion he had already formed in his mind. "Dispatch," he said in an even voice, "I have an individual refusing to leave private property after repeated requests. I may need another unit to assist." The words drifted across the quiet street, and almost immediately the atmosphere changed. Conversation softened. More heads turned toward the entrance. A woman standing at the nearby bus stop quietly unlocked her phone, not to interfere but simply to document what she sensed could become an important moment. Marcus noticed the growing audience, yet his expression remained composed. He folded his hands together and looked toward the officer with the same quiet patience he had shown from the beginning. "Officer," he said, "before anyone else comes here, perhaps we should spend another minute making sure we both understand the situation." Brooks shook his head. "The situation is already clear." Marcus answered with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the clearest situations turn out to be the most misunderstood." The officer let out a short breath. "Do you have identification?" "I do." "Then let me see it." Marcus looked down at the coffee resting beside him before returning his attention to the officer. "May I ask what law requires me to identify myself while I am peacefully sitting here?" The question was respectful. But it immediately frustrated Brooks. He had expected compliance, not conversation. "You are refusing a lawful request." Marcus spoke just as calmly. "I am asking for clarification." The difference between those two statements lingered in the air. Across the lobby, the receptionist glanced nervously toward the property manager's office, only to discover the office door standing open and empty. The manager had stepped out earlier that morning for a routine inspection of another building several blocks away. Nobody inside realized how quickly events outside were unfolding. A delivery driver carrying several packages approached the entrance before slowing down as he recognized Marcus. "Morning, sir," he called naturally. Marcus nodded with a friendly smile. "Good morning. Hope your day is off to a good start." Before the driver could continue the conversation, Officer Brooks stepped between them. "Please continue with your delivery." The driver hesitated for a brief second, looking confused, but eventually nodded and entered the building without another word. Marcus quietly watched him disappear through the glass doors. Another small detail passed almost unnoticed. The electronic entrance unlocked automatically the moment the driver approached because Marcus had already been recognized by the building's access cameras earlier that morning. Brooks never noticed the green confirmation light above the door. His attention remained fixed on the man sitting before him. More residents gathered nearby, speaking in hushed voices that carried just enough volume to create a low hum across the sidewalk. No one wanted to interrupt. Everyone sensed that something significant rested just beneath the surface. Marcus could feel their eyes, yet he refused to perform for the growing crowd. He had spent too many years proving himself to strangers to begin doing so now. Instead, he looked directly at Officer Brooks and asked one final question. "If someone belongs somewhere," he said softly, "would you recognize it by the way they look, or would you recognize it by the truth?" Brooks answered without hesitation. "The truth starts with evidence." Marcus slowly nodded, almost as though he appreciated the answer. "I agree," he replied. "And evidence has a way of arriving right on time." Neither man realized that, only a few blocks away, the property manager had just received an urgent phone call from the front desk describing exactly who was waiting outside the building. The quiet tension settled over the sidewalk like the still air before a summer storm. No one raised their voice anymore because everyone sensed that whatever happened next would matter far more than the conversation that had already unfolded. Marcus Bennett remained seated on the granite steps, his coffee now growing cold beside him while the morning sunlight reflected across the polished glass entrance behind him. Officer Ethan Brooks stood only a few feet away, convinced that patience would eventually force compliance. Yet every passing minute seemed to produce another small detail that quietly challenged the story he believed. A uniformed maintenance technician stepped through the lobby carrying a toolbox before immediately stopping. "Morning, Mr. Bennett," he said with a respectful smile. "The elevator inspection finished early. Everything is running perfectly." Marcus nodded warmly. "Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate the update." Daniel smiled again before noticing the officer standing nearby. His expression shifted briefly to confusion, but after a polite nod he continued toward the parking garage without asking questions. Brooks watched him disappear before turning back toward Marcus. "Do you know him?" he asked. "I know many people who spend time here," Marcus answered simply. Across the entrance another resident approached with a small golden retriever happily wagging its tail. The dog immediately pulled toward Marcus, who laughed softly and scratched behind its ears. "Good to see you again, Winston," the owner said cheerfully. "He always remembers his favorite person." Marcus smiled. "He has better instincts than most of us." The woman chuckled before finally noticing the unusual silence surrounding them. Her smile faded into uncertainty as she quietly continued inside. Brooks crossed his arms again, refusing to acknowledge the growing pattern unfolding in front of him. Instead he focused on what Marcus was wearing, the old pickup truck parked nearby, and the assumption he had made the moment he arrived. Sometimes people become so committed to an opinion that every new fact feels like an inconvenience rather than a clue. A notification sounded from Marcus's phone resting beside his coffee. He glanced at the screen but chose not to answer. Seconds later another call appeared. Then another. Brooks noticed the repeated calls. "Someone trying to warn you?" he asked. Marcus looked at the display before locking the screen again. "Someone trying to find me," he replied calmly. "They usually do." The answer only deepened the officer's suspicion. Meanwhile, inside the lobby, the receptionist finally reached the property manager. "Mr. Collins," she said, trying to remain calm, "you need to come back immediately. Mr. Bennett is outside, and there is an officer questioning him." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You said Mr. Bennett?" Thomas Collins asked carefully. "Yes, sir." "Do not let anything change until I get there. I am 5 minutes away." He ended the call before the receptionist could say another word. Back outside, the crowd had quietly grown. Nobody shouted. Nobody interfered. They simply watched, each person trying to understand why a conversation that should have lasted 30 seconds had stretched into something much larger. Marcus looked down the street for only a brief moment before returning his attention to Officer Brooks. Far in the distance, a dark sedan turned onto the block a little faster than the surrounding traffic. Marcus recognized it immediately, though he gave no sign that anything had changed. Instead, he picked up his coffee, took one unhurried sip, and looked back at the officer with the same calm expression he had carried from the very beginning. "You said the truth begins with evidence," Marcus said quietly. "I believe you are about to have all the evidence you need." The dark sedan came to a smooth stop beside the curb, drawing almost no attention at first because there was nothing remarkable about the vehicle itself. What mattered was the man who stepped out. Thomas Collins, the property manager, closed the driver's door with unusual urgency and walked briskly toward the entrance, his eyes fixed on Marcus long before he noticed Officer Ethan Brooks standing nearby. Several residents recognized Collins immediately and quietly exchanged puzzled looks. They had rarely seen him move that quickly. Marcus remained seated, watching him approach with the same quiet composure that had defined the entire morning. There was no sign of relief on his face, no expectation of rescue. He simply waited, as though every event unfolding before him had been another page in a familiar story. Collins reached the bottom of the granite steps and spoke before catching his breath. "Mr. Bennett, I am very sorry I was not here sooner." His words landed with surprising weight. The nearby conversation stopped. Even Officer Brooks seemed momentarily uncertain. Marcus stood for the first time that morning and offered a warm smile. "Good morning, Thomas. It looks like you had to interrupt your schedule." Collins shook his head. "Nothing today is more important than being here." He looked toward Officer Brooks with visible confusion. "Officer, has there been some misunderstanding?" Brooks answered confidently. "I received a report about an individual refusing to leave private property." Collins glanced at Marcus, then back at the officer, almost searching for another explanation that would make the sentence reasonable. None came. "Private property," he repeated quietly. "Yes," Brooks replied. "This gentleman has declined repeated requests to leave the entrance." Collins took a slow breath before choosing his words carefully. "Officer, I believe that is because he has every right to be here." Brooks frowned. "Is he a resident?" Collins hesitated for only a second. "He is much more than that." A ripple of curiosity spread through the small crowd gathering near the sidewalk. Marcus said nothing. He simply watched people process the conversation one sentence at a time. Collins reached into the leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm and removed several neatly organized documents. He did not hand them over immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Marcus. "Would you like me to explain?" Marcus answered with his usual calm voice. "Only the truth, Thomas. Nothing more." Collins nodded respectfully before turning back toward the officer. 5 years ago, this property was scheduled for demolition after multiple investors walked away. The neighborhood was struggling. Families were leaving. Businesses were closing. One person decided the community deserved another chance. Brooks listened without speaking. Collins continued. That person invested millions of dollars restoring this building instead of replacing it. Affordable apartments remained available. Local businesses received long-term leases. Security improved. Employment opportunities increased. Hundreds of families stayed because someone believed this neighborhood was worth saving. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have created. Brooks looked from Collins to Marcus, searching both faces for some indication that this was an exaggeration. He found none. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly toward the granite steps beneath his feet before looking back at the building rising above them. Every window reflected years of perseverance that no passerby could see. Every hallway carried memories of difficult decisions made when failure had seemed far easier than hope. Yet he had never wanted recognition. He only wanted the community to succeed. Collins gently placed the folder against his chest and spoke one final sentence that caused every person within earshot to fall completely silent. "Officer," he said with quiet certainty, "the man you have been asking to leave is the owner of this entire building." Officer Ethan Brooks felt the certainty he had carried onto the sidewalk begin to dissolve beneath the weight of a truth he had never considered. His eyes moved from Thomas Collins to Marcus Bennett and then toward the towering building behind them, as though seeing it for the very first time. The quiet confidence Marcus had displayed from the beginning suddenly made perfect sense. It had never been the confidence of someone pretending to belong. It was the confidence of someone who had never needed permission to be there. Collins carefully opened the leather portfolio and removed several official documents. He held them respectfully rather than dramatically, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Property records, ownership certificates, renovation permits, and investment agreements were organized with remarkable precision. Every page carried the same name: Marcus Bennett. Collins extended the folder toward the officer. "You are welcome to review any of these," he said calmly. "Everything is publicly recorded." Brooks accepted the documents without saying a word. His eyes scanned the pages one after another. Every signature matched. Every address matched. Every date confirmed the same reality. 5 years of ownership. Millions invested. Hundreds of apartments restored. There was no mystery left to solve. Only a mistake that had become impossible to ignore. Around them, the crowd remained remarkably quiet. No one celebrated. No one mocked the officer. Instead, people simply watched as assumptions gave way to undeniable facts. The maintenance technician Daniel returned from the parking garage and stopped beside several residents. "I told you Mr. Bennett visits almost every month," he whispered gently. "He likes checking on things himself." Another resident nodded. "He remembers everyone's name." An elderly man added softly, "When my wife was recovering from surgery, he arranged temporary accessibility improvements before we even asked." Each comment arrived naturally, not as praise offered for the moment, but as ordinary memories shared by people who had experienced Marcus's kindness long before anyone else knew the story unfolding on the sidewalk. Brooks slowly lowered the folder. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice noticeably quieter than before, "I was not aware." Marcus offered a calm nod. "I know." There was no satisfaction in his answer. No triumph. Only honesty. Brooks looked down briefly before meeting Marcus's eyes again. "I should have asked more questions before making conclusions." Marcus smiled with quiet understanding. Questions usually cost less than assumptions. The simple sentence settled over everyone standing nearby. It was not spoken to embarrass the officer. It was spoken as a lesson every person present could carry home. Collins closed the portfolio and stepped back, allowing the moment to belong to the two men alone. Morning traffic continued flowing through the intersection. The breeze moved gently through the maple trees. Somewhere nearby a church bell marked the passing hour, reminding everyone that the city had continued moving, while one conversation quietly revealed something much larger than a misunderstanding outside an apartment building. Marcus looked toward the entrance and then back at Brooks. "This property has always been about creating a place where people feel welcome," he said. "That goal does not change because today became uncomfortable." Brooks listened without interruption. For the first time since arriving, he saw not a stranger on expensive steps but a man whose vision had strengthened an entire neighborhood. The granite beneath their feet had never belonged to appearances. It belonged to perseverance, patience, and years of work that could never be measured by a person's clothing, the vehicle they drove, or the color of their skin. The silence that followed carried far more weight than any argument ever could. Officer Ethan Brooks carefully handed the folder back to Thomas Collins, his movement slower now, as though every page had forced him to reconsider not only what had happened that morning but how quickly certainty could replace curiosity. The second patrol unit that had been requested only minutes earlier pulled quietly to the curb. A younger officer stepped out, glanced toward the small gathering, and immediately sensed that the situation had changed. Brooks walked over before the officer could ask a question. "Everything is under control," he said calmly. "There is no further assistance needed." The second officer nodded respectfully and returned to the patrol vehicle without another word. Nearby, several residents who had quietly recorded portions of the encounter lowered their phones. No one applauded. No one laughed. The moment did not belong to humiliation. It belonged to reflection. Marcus Bennett looked around at the familiar faces standing outside the building. Many of them had lived there for years. Some had raised children within those walls. Others had opened small businesses on the ground floor because affordable leases had made impossible dreams become real. Every person represented a story that had mattered more to Marcus than profit ever had. Thomas Collins spoke softly. "Would you like me to notify legal counsel about what happened?" Marcus gently shook his head. "No. There is nothing to gain from making this larger than it already is." Collins looked surprised. "Even after everything?" Marcus smiled. "The goal has never been to win an argument. The goal has always been to improve the community." Those words spread quietly through the crowd. An elderly resident who had watched the entire exchange wiped away a small tear before smiling to herself. A young father standing beside his daughter looked down and whispered, "Remember this moment. Always learn who someone is before deciding where they belong." The little girl nodded without fully understanding, yet she sensed that something important had just happened. Officer Brooks stepped back toward Marcus. "Mr. Bennett," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology. I allowed my first impression to become my final conclusion. I should have approached this differently." Marcus listened carefully before extending his hand. "Thank you for saying that." Brooks accepted the handshake with quiet gratitude. It lasted only a moment, yet everyone watching understood its meaning. Accountability did not erase mistakes, but acknowledging them allowed something better to begin. The maintenance technician Daniel smiled from across the entrance before returning to work. Residents slowly continued with their morning routines. Delivery trucks resumed unloading packages. The neighborhood found its familiar rhythm once again, as though the street itself had taken a deep breath. Before walking inside, Marcus paused and looked back at the granite steps where the morning had begun. "These steps were never built to keep people out," he said softly. "They were built to welcome people home." Collins smiled in agreement. Brooks looked at the entrance one final time, now seeing not merely an expensive building but a place shaped by years of vision, generosity, and perseverance. The lesson he carried away could never have been found in a report or taught during training. It had been waiting quietly on those front steps all along, hidden beneath ordinary clothes, calm words, and the dignity of a man who never needed to prove his worth because the truth had already done it for him. The following Saturday morning, Marcus Bennett returned to the same granite steps carrying the same coffee mug, wearing the same faded grey hoodie that had sparked so many assumptions only days before. The difference was not the building, the neighborhood, or even the weather. The difference was perspective. Residents greeted him with familiar smiles as they walked past. Children laughed in the courtyard while families enjoyed the fresh summer air. The neighborhood felt exactly as he had always hoped it would, peaceful, welcoming, and full of possibility. Thomas Collins stepped outside with a clipboard before smiling. "Everything is back to normal," he said. Marcus looked around at the families entering and leaving the building. "That is the best outcome anyone could ask for." A few minutes later, a patrol vehicle slowly turned onto the street. Marcus recognized it immediately, and so did several residents nearby. Officer Ethan Brooks stepped out alone, removed his sunglasses, and walked toward the entrance with a noticeably different expression than he had carried only a few days earlier. There was no urgency in his stride and no assumptions in his eyes. When he reached the steps, he stopped a respectful distance away. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett." Marcus smiled warmly. "Good morning, officer." Brooks nodded toward the building. "I wanted to thank you for accepting my apology the other day. I have spent a great deal of time thinking about what happened." Marcus listened quietly. Brooks continued. "Sometimes we believe experience has taught us everything we need to know. Then one moment reminds us there is still more to learn. Marcus looked across the street where neighbors greeted one another outside the local bakery. "Learning is valuable," he replied. "The important part is deciding what to do after the lesson arrives." Brooks nodded. "I have started asking one extra question before reaching conclusions. It has already changed several conversations this week." Marcus smiled, not because he felt vindicated, but because growth always mattered more to him than being proven right. Nearby, the young father and his daughter from earlier in the week walked past the entrance again. The little girl looked up at Marcus with a bright smile. "Mom says you built this place so families could stay together." Marcus chuckled softly. "A lot of people helped build it. I was only one of them." The little girl thought for a moment before asking, "Why were you so calm that day?" Marcus looked at the granite steps beneath his feet before answering. "Because if I let someone else's misunderstanding decide who I am, then I would stop being the person I worked so hard to become." The little girl nodded as though she would remember those words for a very long time. Brooks quietly listened beside them, understanding that the lesson was meant for everyone, including himself. As the morning continued, life settled into its familiar rhythm once again. Delivery drivers greeted residents by name. The maintenance crew tended the gardens. Neighbors stopped to talk before heading to work. Nothing about the building announced who owned it, and Marcus preferred it that way. He believed the strongest foundations were not made from stone or steel but from dignity, fairness, and the willingness to see people before judging them. As the sunlight reflected across the entrance one final time, Marcus took another sip of coffee and watched the community he loved continue its ordinary day. The granite steps had never changed. The building had never changed. Only the people standing upon them had. And perhaps that is how real justice often arrives, not through anger or revenge, but through truth quietly revealing what prejudice could never see. Because a person's worth is never measured by the clothes they wear, the car they drive, or the color of their skin. It is measured by the character they carry long before anyone chooses to look closely enough to see it.